All right. So focusing on emotion-based coping today for our More Than Manage Starter Pack series. I realized we didn't introduce ourselves quite yet, so I will start and then I'll let Callista do the same. But I'm Brooke Powers. I am currently one of the doctoral interns in the Counseling Center and use she, her pronouns.
Yeah, my name's Callista. I'm a master's level trainee here at the Counseling Center, and I also use she, her pronouns. And I'm really excited to be here with you all and talk about these skills today.
Yeah. So this is us. um, yeah, just to kind of have you all get to know us a little bit. Those are some of the things that we're into. um, but yeah, just kind of get to knowing us a little bit more. I don't know if you wanted to share any more, Callista, about your bio.
Yeah, no, yeah, I just wanted to kind of iterate that we are real people and we want this to be a fun experience. And so we welcome you to also show up as who you are, how you are in this space, and not feel inhibited by whatever might be coming up for you during our time together. So yeah, just some fun facts about us to humanize us a little bit and let you get to know us a little bit more. So yeah.
Yeah. And if y'all want to, feel free to put anything in the chat if you want to introduce yourself or whatever you feel like you want and need to do. This is going to be very human conversations today and exercises that we plan to do. So yeah, I'm very excited. So we'll jump in. Want to talk for a moment quickly about just before we get into this, and we already spoke to that just a minute ago, is that this is being recorded today for being able to have this posted to our YouTube channel. That way folks can use it all the time whenever they need and can refer back to it because it's going to be an awesome resource. And so another thing to consider that this is a workshop series that is not considered therapy treatment or any kind of mental health treatment that we're offering at the center. This is specifically psychoed in nature. So this is not designed if you have any kind of emergency going on currently. We recommend that you either mention something to us via chat, but more importantly, I would say call the counseling center and they can connect you with somebody immediately here to be able to talk to you about those concerns. You can also visit our website if it's not an emergency and you're just curious about getting to know a little bit more about us. And then lastly, around confidentiality, this is something that is obviously open to App State students, faculty, and staff. And so we recognize that Callista and I, in a typical therapeutic setting, have ethical and legal obligations to maintain all of your privacy and names and all the things that go into working with folks. But in this setting, this is just kind of an honor system of respecting one another and the privacy that we want and deserve in this space. So just being thoughtful of how much you are willing to share, knowing that, but also holding each other accountable and hopefully respecting those wishes as well.
Perfect. So just a little bit of background of what today is going to look like. We're going to be throwing a lot of stuff at you. Brooke and I are very excited and we have a lot of ideas that we want to share. So also want to just point out that everything that we talk about today, we actually have a handout for as well. So we'll be able to send that to you following today's presentation if you're interested. So just let us know if you want that resource. Also encourage you to take notes as we go if that would be helpful to you. But just kind of an overview of what we'll be doing. We're going to start with a little bit of a check-in, getting to know each other a little bit as much as you're willing to share. And then we're going to be going over what one of the skills that we'll be talking about today is called RAIN. And we'll go into detail a little bit later, but it's basically a way of conceptualizing emotion, talking about like how do we recognize them, allow them to exist within our bodies and within our experience. How do we learn from them, inquire and ask questions about them? And what are some ways that we can nurture particularly big emotions as well? So that's kind of a general overview of some of the stuff that we'll be exploring. And of course, we've compiled a ton of resources to also send you away with some goodies for you to continue your exploration of emotions even after today's presentation.
Awesome.
Yeah, so to get us started, I love the usual "How are you?" or "What's your day going like?" Those kinds of questions, but I also like to put a little creative spin on it. So today I invite you to describe how you're feeling, basically, how are you? But instead of using "I'm good" or "I'm happy" or "I'm bummed" or "I'm stressed," describe yourself using weather terms. So for an example, I'm kind of arriving My internal weather system feels sunny, a little overcast, a little misty, but I see the sun peeking through the clouds, and I'm feeling hopeful and excited for today. So feel free to pop in the chat how you're feeling today using weather terms, or any other creative way you'd like to share, or feel free to unmute and share with us to kind of check in with each other before we dive in.
The meatballs. That's funny. You're just going to make me hungry now.
Awesome. Yeah, and also gonna, like Brooke said, we're leaving the chat open throughout our time together today. So feel free to share as we go, kind of where are you at? What are you thinking? What's coming up for you? And yeah, appreciate y'all's willingness to be creative and to play around with this idea. All right, cool. Thank you all for sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just recognizing also that I think of boon weather too, and I'm like leaning into this area of like it could change in 5 minutes. So I think that's also sometimes how emotions can function too, and recognizing that so often, we are probably feeling a variety of things, a mix of emotions rather than just one. And so I think just recognizing the plethora that we exist in on a daily basis, whether we are able to sit with that and recognize it, or if it takes a little time to come to that space, we'll walk through that today. So diving into rain. Oh, sorry, Calista, you're going to talk about rain a little bit more.
No, you're good. No, I'm just gonna let you roll with this. Yeah, I'm so excited and just like ready to talk about everything. Yeah. So so I spoke on it a little bit a second ago, but today our presentation is organized under this umbrella, no pun intended, of rain. So this is a skill that you can use. We're kind of using it to form our presentation, and it's also a skill that you can use to engage with your emotions. So we're going to talk about how can you recognize when emotions are coming up for you, how can you allow them, how can you learn from them, inquire about them, and how can you nurture them. So that's kind of a general overview of where we're headed.
Yeah. So we'll start with the R of rain, which is recognize. And so this first step is understanding, first off, just like emotions, we all have them. We all recognize that we do. And we all know probably in what our relationship is with our emotions, but sometimes digging a little deeper and recognizing like the value of what they are and why they're important can be really useful. Emotions can sometimes get a really bad rap, to be not helpful, or they get in the way, or that they cause us to do things that we're not proud of or we regret later. Recognizing that emotions have such a big effect on so many different parts of our existence, in our bodies and our thoughts and how we act. And we'll talk about that more as we go. And in the rest of the workshop series of July, we talk about other pieces of that. So there's an interconnectedness there that happens with emotions, and recognizing what that may look like for you. And every person is going to be different in how that is experienced. And recognizing like there's our world, and then we have these larger systems that are at play as well, and how that can influence emotions on a daily basis or a pretty frequent basis. So we'll talk a minute about primary and secondary emotions and what that looks like in terms of timing and what those can look like. And then lastly, quickly helping others with challenging emotions. This is all part of on that handout that we created for everybody. So if we end up having to skim through that quickly to make sure we cover other things, that content will be there. So I just want to make sure we share that. So when we talk about why we want to do emotion-based coping, we realized that recognizing our emotions and learning what to do with them is probably one of the most important skills that you can have as a human, is just existing in our worlds. That being able to know what it is that's happening for us and what it's spurring us to do with it, whether we know that or don't know that, can be really powerful. And so we recognize just how useful this can be to know For example, if emotions feel like a really troubled relationship that you might have with them, recognizing that like it's hard to know what to do with them unless you know what they are. And so sometimes starting there, or if it's like, I want to befriend myself and what comes up for me and allow that and be more compassionate, then all of these spaces will meet you at today. And so, big reasons why doing this is important. Understanding what's behind emotion can sometimes be really useful. I tell people emotions are like really good data that we sometimes need to recognize the value of. It's telling us something really useful. There's a message behind our emotions. And that can boil down to anything as simple as like they can keep us alive. Like, for example, when we feel fear, we need to respond very quickly. Like if I'm, in the road or there's like a car coming or whatever's happening, that fear is going to help me move and act very quickly. And so that emotions can be instrumental in our survival, but they can also be really helpful in terms of like the nuances of our existence. Thinking about folks who really have that connection with like their gut, of like that gut feeling, or I have this intuition, or I get the sense, or whatever that experience is, where it kind of tells us something that we might need to know. Maybe it's telling us that I'm uncomfortable or I'm nervous, and maybe that is telling us that it's unsafe or that we need to be careful or whatever that looks like. Or maybe we're feeling open and receptive. We're feeling joyful or whatever that looks like too. And being able to sit and appreciate that as well is really valuable in this process. So something I wanted to include is a big piece of what we do in therapy. I'm going to make sure. There we go. All of that's on there. So this is borrowed from Abby Ben Mugen. I'm not sure exactly how that last name is pronounced. I probably did not say that right. But she's an artist that in her own work in therapy was able to take what we commonly see as feelings wheel. If you Googled feelings wheel, there's going to be so many different versions of them. I found one for a dog. It's just really neat. There's like so many different things. And I found this one to be really impactful because through her own therapy, she was able to recognize maybe after 2020 what other feelings may be involved. And there's a lot more on here. And so this process of utilizing a feelings wheel is multi-folded, multi-functional, I guess, in the sense of starting in the middle. They are these kind of really large strong core feelings that we often, children will know. They'll be like, I feel angry, I feel sad. Like we use these labels to describe how we're feeling, down to kind of a pretty boiled down sense. But oftentimes we are feeling much more than just sad, right? Like we have something that's much more nuanced that's experienced. And so being able to start somewhere in those middle sections and be able to branch out until you find that thing is more accurately representing how you're feeling, and the multiple things of how you're feeling is really helpful. And so it's kind of that guide to start middle and work our way out. And so being able to label what we're feeling is a really helpful way to know how we can communicate with other people. It also can communicate within ourselves of like, what is it that I need? And we'll get there later about that step of nurturing your own emotion. And recognizing that this process is directly aimed at validating your experience, at validating your emotions of what's coming up for you, not questioning, not judging, not necessarily like criticizing the feelings, but just being like, you're existing. I'm going to allow you to exist, and I'm going to just sit with them and accept this for myself. Because an emotional invalidation, or even more extreme versions of like gaslighting, can be really harmful, and it's not going to make those emotions go away. It can cause a slew of other things that aren't helpful. And so this process is directly aiming at acknowledging and validating what's happening for you, and putting it into the open. And so we'll go through that process of doing that. So I'll lead us there in just a moment. But being able to do this, it's like I said, there's a lot of good purposes of it. Not only is it something that can help us practice validating ourselves, because so often I think it's easy to be invalidated by things or people or our world around us, the culture that we live in that is telling us certain messages, and so giving yourself permission to feel what you're feeling in multiple things. You might circle half of the wheel, and that's okay. It can also build our emotional vocabulary. So thinking about emotional intelligence and all the different tenets that come with that, recognizing how valuable it is to be able to put words to what's happening. We are teaching children how to do that all the time of like, what is it that's going on? Communicate that. Let's work on this and build that. But as adults, we still need to do that. I sometimes will laugh and I'll pull out a feelings wheel myself and use that. And so it helps us give language to how we feel so that we can communicate with other people. And it helps us slow down and recognize and be mindful and connect and show up how it and realize how these things show up in how we feel and how we think, what happens in our body and what we do with all of that. And there's so many other ways, what happens in our spirit and whatnot. So the multi-interconnectedness that we've referenced so many times. I want to pause. I'm sorry, I have to leave early. We can definitely do that. If you want us to send you anything and you have to head out, just feel free to chat Callista or I your email address. We'd be more than happy to send that. So just make sure you do that. So this next piece is taking it a step further and recognizing that emotions are more than just expression. They show up in our bodies. We know that what we feel with emotions is likely going to be felt in different parts of our bodies. And anytime that we are experiencing them, they're there. We can't think ourselves out of emotion. We can't push ourselves out of emotion. We can try our best to push emotion away or down or aside or whatever that looks like. And there's sometimes really useful reasons to do that. And we know that they don't stay there. They don't stay away. They don't forever go away and dissolve, that they're likely going to be stored somewhere. And we recognize that. We know that with trauma work. We know that with just emotions in general, how that happens. It might affect our bodies, our guts, and recognize the research that comes out and talks about gut health and how so much of our mental and emotional health is centered and comes from what happens in our gut. You know, how we can, from our gut, feel butterflies and really excited options and eagerness, and also feel that gut feeling of like dread and be like, oh, like, so there's just so much that can happen within our bodies that help us know what is happening emotionally. And so I'm curious if folks want to throw into the chat, if that feels helpful to continue doing it that way, or unmute. I'm curious if you recognize that there's parts of your body that you feel emotion infrequently, and maybe what emotion centers where. Yeah, so comfort and gut health, absolutely. I'll be transparent and know that sometimes I don't realize what stress or emotions are there until my body's like, hey, these are things are happening in me and I need you to know it. So yeah, sometimes we will notice it first. Sometimes we notice it later. Everyone can experience that differently. Chest is a big one. Yeah, for sure. Headaches, tenseness. Sometimes I realize how much my shoulders are up in my ears. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. So keep adding to the chat if you want to share. The last thing I wanted to do is maybe just take a moment to put all of this together. And so, Callista, how much time do you think we should maybe dedicate to this?
Yeah, maybe 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I invite you all to, you can either take a picture of this, of course it's in that handout, but for the moment, we're gonna just spend some time like individually working through this reflection activity here. And so it's putting a lot of this stuff together. So I'm going to just kind of give us instructions and lead us through. Feel free to, if you want extra privacy, to do what you need on Zoom. We're Zoom equipped probably at this point in the year, but just do what you need to do as you kind of reflect on some of these things today. So I want you to just find a quiet moment and take a breath. Maybe take a drink of the tea or water or whatever it is that you have next to you, and just find a way to kind of ground and center yourself. And I want you to look at the wheel that we've been looking at and just allow your eyes to follow it, go around it, gravitate somewhere, and just let it go wherever it feels drawn. Maybe you make your way around the wheel. Maybe you already know, yep, I'm in this category. I'm going to stick in that slice of the wheel here. And as you're doing that, I want you to write down any words that resonate with your experience or what's happening for you. And like I said earlier, try to focus on, a handful of things. Give yourself at least 5 or 3 or whatever it is that is helpful. If you need to, feel free to Google whatever word that you're like, I want to know more of what that means. Feel free to do that. I do that all the time. So we can look it up. We can think of different ways we can illustrate that word and understand what some of these feel like and mean for us. And then if you feel ready, move over to what emotions are coming up for you in your body. So drawing those, coloring them. And again, you might just have your own piece of paper. You might just be thinking through this in your head, and that's okay. But just think about what you would do with that. And then if you want to take one more minute, feel free to jump to one of the pieces on here, such as what's on the left side. What's going on in my world? What's going on in the world? There's a lot happening in the world, and that influences us in so many ways. Maybe you jump over to how do I care for myself? Maybe you're thinking about where's my energy tank at? Am I running pretty low? Just take one more minute to do that. So I know this isn't giving you enough time to probably fully pay to this practice, but if anyone feels like they want to share anything that came up for them or any part of this process that you wish to share with other people, feel free to put it into the chat or unmute if you feel comfortable. I saw the chat here. Where do I find the handout? I'm sorry, I should have spoke to that earlier. For right now, you can always write those pieces down on a piece of paper, what you need for yourself. If you want to scan that QR code on the bottom left, that's a direct link to her website to be able to download that, but it's also in our handout. So there's going to be a few spots. Okay. I'll keep moving ahead if folks feel good about that, but feel free to continue doing this on your own or continue that practice after we wrap up today. And so thinking about how we experience emotions and using the metaphor that we often see as an iceberg is that there are going to be things that we see that are on the surface. And sometimes that part that we see is pretty small. But what happens is with the iceberg is that there's usually like a really big like mass sum of it beneath the water. And so when we think about exploring what's happening for us emotionally, sometimes something like anger, which is oftentimes what we see with the iceberg, is that something angry is really easy to be able to observe. It's very visible. And what we sometimes don't recognize that is below anger, and sometimes really a much more triggered emotion, sometimes depending on the situation, are the things below it. And those things can be what end up showing as angry, for example, especially if anger is something, using this example, if maybe that's a safer quote unquote emotion to express. Maybe culturally or in our society, anger feels like it's a more acceptable emotion compared to what shame looks like here. So just thinking about how that can look, and the benefit of looking a little bit more beneath the surface. And so when I think about primary emotions, those are typically those emotional reactions to a situation. It is that first thing that pops up for you, which is why it's primary, the first thing. And then secondary is this idea that it's probably the emotional response to your first emotion. So I think just highlighting that experience as well as we're thinking about what else can be going on with the emotion that we identify is that sometimes there's this added process for various reasons that can be really judgmental or really critical or can add, for example, like feelings of guilt. There's an emotion and then there's guilt associated with feeling that emotion or whatever potential secondary thing can come with that, with whatever emotion we're feeling, and recognizing that this process is natural. It happens. It's really easy to do this. And that there's nothing bad about our emotions. When we say bad, quote unquote, that it's so often that we say like bad emotions and good emotions. And sometimes it's easier to recognize that these are all telling us something and acknowledging that. And I don't want to jump ahead of Calissa and talking about allowing. So just recognizing what else might be there for you. And so I want to probably move pretty quickly through this one. This is just helpful pieces of information, and it's in that handout of being able to support other people with emotions. It really ties into validating other people, recognizing sometimes that secondary emotion of what can make us doubt or judge or be critical of the primary emotion of what's happening for you. So recognizing how we can validate ourselves and validate other people. Um, and so just a few things that are helpful here. Calissa, I'm not sure if you have thoughts or things you want to add in on this one.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate us being able to touch on this. And yeah, for time's sake, we'll probably leave most of it for the handout. But yeah, just acknowledging too, I think a major piece to think about when somebody you love or somebody you care about is experiencing big emotions. Sometimes that can cause them to respond to you in ways that you don't expect or in ways that you don't appreciate or feel like you deserve. And so I think a major piece of helping others manage their big emotions is practicing patience, and things like that. So there are a lot of additional tips in here, but that's something that I've been trying to practice with people in my life and practice with myself. I'm lashing out right now because I'm experiencing all of these things. How can I be a better friend? Or how can I have my friends be a support system for me? And how can I build that connection? So there's a lot of pieces here, and we're open to talking about them more as you have questions and things like that. But this information's in our handout as well.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So yeah, so moving right along to allowing these emotions to take place. So some of this is going to be what Brooke touched on because all of it's related. Emotions come in and out of a lot of different spaces. And so when we're talking about allowing, sometimes I think we do have a tendency to qualify emotions as good or bad. So good emotions are joy, happiness, those kinds of feel good things. Those are the good ones. Those are the socially acceptable and the culturally acceptable emotions. And then we have things like anger and sadness and grief, or those other things that get this bad rap of being bad or something to avoid. And so part of this allowance, so we've recognized what we're feeling, we've been able to name or define, like, where is this coming up for me? What's going on? Now we have the opportunity to allow those feelings to take place. So not sweeping them under the rug, not pushing them away, not being scared of them or qualifying them as good or bad, but acknowledging that emotions are complex. So there are a lot of different ways that you can allow yourself to experience the emotions that are coming up for you. One of the primary ways I think is really helpful is seeking to practice a non-judgmental stance or even a compassionate stance towards yourself when you're feeling stretched pretty thin and emotions are coming to the surface much easier, or you're maybe feeling physically tired, or whatever that is. Offering yourself some grace, and not saying, I shouldn't be sad right now, or I shouldn't be angry, or this is a bad emotion that I'm experiencing, and pushing them away, but just saying, you know what? I'm angry, I'm tired, I'm sad. I'm going to allow myself to feel that, because we've also noticed that if you push those things down or push them to the side, they'll come up some other way. All you're doing is building the lower part of this iceberg we talked about. And so the tip will show, and the bottom is growing. And so it doesn't serve you or your relationships or your life to not allow space for you to experience those emotions that come up. I would also encourage you to explore what it feels like to not shy away from emotional expression, whether that's crying or whether that's um, even laughing. Sometimes I think people stifle their laughter because it's embarrassing or feels uncomfortable. But that's the body's natural response to engaging with how you feel emotionally. And so I invite you to do that. And then kind of circling back to this non-judgmental, compassionate stance, one of the ways you can do this is by practicing mindfulness. So we'll jump to the next slide and kind of talk about what is mindfulness? How do I practice it? So one of my favorite metaphors for practicing mindfulness and engaging in this kind of meditative state of checking in with your body, checking in with your emotions, is this image of a river. So kind of thinking of your emotions, your thoughts, your experiences, your circumstances as this river that's going through the mountains or through the valley, wherever your emotional, mental space is, whatever that beautiful space is, having this river running through the middle. And instead of getting caught up in the current, jumping right into the water, following those emotions wherever they go, or following those thoughts until you spiral and work yourself up and hurt your own feelings maybe, or those kinds of things. Mindfulness is sitting on the bank. Mindfulness is sitting on the rock and watching these emotions take place, watching these thoughts happen, and not getting so caught up that they make you feel overwhelmed or scared, or like you want to push away or run and hide. So there are a lot of different ways to practice mindfulness and to practice this opportunity of recognizing how you feel and allowing yourself to feel those things. And in the next slide, as well as on the handout, we have a lot of different resources listed of how you can engage in a more mindfulness meditative practice. So Brooke, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, we have tons of apps, which might be the most accessible and easiest way to jump right into a mindfulness practice. There are also podcasts that can teach you about what is mindfulness, what is meditation, how do I engage in it, how do I view myself with kindness, how do I treat myself with grace and understanding and compassion, and how do I particularly look at my emotions as not something to be scared of or not something to push away or stuff down, but how can I be open to my experience. There are also a lot of books that you can engage in, and some of my favorite resources are available here at App State. So one being this summer series. So we're going to be meeting every week at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays throughout the month of July, talking about each of these areas. And mindfulness comes into play in almost every one of them, if not all of them, because it's a helpful tool. So you're welcome to continue to join us on Wednesdays at 3. And also there's the Koru mindfulness class, which is here at App State as well, which is another way that you can engage in this non-judgmental, compassionate view of yourself and your emotions. So all of these are listed on the handout as well, so we'll be sure to get that to you so you have these listen and try maybe exploring some of these things. Yeah, and then so we've recognized what's going on for us. We've allowed ourselves the time and the space to feel those things and not push them away. Now maybe we've arrived to this place of, I want to learn what's going on, because emotions are amazing teachers. They are, as Brooke mentioned earlier, they're pointing to something. They're saying something to you. They're trying to teach you something about your experience. We joke about hanger, anger induced by being hungry. It's real. I would just like to go on record and say that hanger is my primary emotion at all times. But we're joking, but it's true. Like oftentimes when I'm angry or irritable or I'm being short with somebody, it's because my emotions are trying to tell me I'm hungry or I'm tired, or maybe I'm overworked and I need to say no, or maybe I need to take a step back. So taking a second and inquiring, why is this emotion coming up for me right now? You can do this in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about some questions in just a second. But another way, just as Brooke talked about earlier with that chart with all of these are where these emotions show up in your body. So sometimes if you don't know cognitively kind of what's going on or can't think of a particular reason, maybe checking in with your body, saying, where is this sitting? Am I experiencing pain anywhere? Am I experiencing emotional weight or emotional pain somewhere in my body? And then, of course, practicing mindfulness as well. It's another great way to be able to tune in and ask questions about what's coming up for me. So a couple of different questions you can ask. Moving on to our next slide here is the first being, why am I feeling this way? Is there something I can identify that is inspiring these emotions to come up in me? And a lot of times, being able to identify what that piece is can also help you identify how to respond. So if I'm angry because I'm hungry, maybe I should eat, or if I'm sad because I'm exhausted, maybe I should take a nap. So that can be a really helpful process to kind of break down what's going on for me. Similarly, what are my emotions trying to teach me about these things, like my physical needs, the hunger, the sleeping, those kinds of things. Also my relationships. If I find I'm in this relationship where I consistently feel this emotion, what does that say? Is this a safe space for me to be? Do I feel comfortable in this relationship? Do I feel challenged by this relationship? Also think about circumstances. I think about things like that interconnectedness piece Brooke was talking about earlier. Like maybe you're financially stressed and that's coming up as an emotion. Maybe I know I get irritable or I get really tense and I tend to push people away when I have other circumstances going on in my life. And so being able to check in, what are these things trying to teach me? What are these emotions trying to say to me? Because oftentimes I feel like emotions are screaming at us to say, look at this, like respond, fix, nurture these things. So, and then the last piece is, what's one small step I can take to respond to this emotion? So Brooke's going to tap into this in a little bit, but that's another question that you can reflect on of like, what's coming up for me and how can I respond to this? Because it's trying to say something to me. So I would not be a counselor if I didn't speak to the interconnectedness piece between our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, as well as our bodies. And we use a triangle, but Brooke and I have talked about how it's not an accurate shape. There's actually a lot more points than just 3, but for the sake of time and simplicity today, I'll just mention that a lot of times our emotions are informing our experience, and they can cause ripple effects in our lives or be the ripple effect of other areas of our life. So thinking about our thoughts or our behaviors, how are these things being influenced and how are they communicating with one another? And again, what can we learn? So that's what Inquire is, taking that step back and allowing our emotions to be our teachers. So yeah, I want to transfer it over to Brooke to continue talking about this. What do I do with my emotions when I experience them? How do I respond to them?
And I love this ripple effect piece here of just thinking about how emotions impact our thoughts and behaviors in our body and all these different pieces that we're talking about and we'll talk about in future weeks. Because so often I think that sometimes we have like a sweet spot. Like there's just sometimes I think that we like have a sweet spot for like, I'm a very like thought-based person, or maybe I'm much more like I feel like I'm a feeler. Or like I'm a doer, right? So like everybody kind of has a sweet spot. And so that's what I love about like examining how this all like ripples and affects each other. Because I think when you think about it in like how it could be problematic, you think about how something that I'm feeling is going to tell me, and then my thought of I'm feeling sad, so my thought is like, well, I should just not go and I should cancel. And then behaviorally we maybe isolate, and that can make us then feel, gosh, I'm really more lonely now and sad. And then how that can just like perpetuate as one example. And in a good way, that also means that if we have a sweet spot of like what's useful for us to start with, sometimes it's that. So maybe it's nurturing the emotion for you and recognizing, what do I do with sadness and how can I speak to that and nurture that? Maybe you're a doer and you're like, all right, I'm going to do something. There's research that says, like, I think about like when you go into like you're nervous for a presentation, and the research that says if you put yourself into like a stance, it tends to increase that emotion, or like forcing you to smile, like it can increase actually some feelings of joy or happiness or excitement or something. So recognize that our behaviors have a lot of power, that we'll talk about the last week of July, as well as thoughts and like how thoughts can propel us in so many different directions. So I love it. I wanted to hype it up a little bit more and recognize that like if emotions are or are not your thing, that there's different points that you can do to create a really helpful cycle or a really helpful ripple effect, as well as, of course, like how it can be not helpful. And so this last piece of rain is nurture. And so we've recognized we are allowing them to exist non-judgmentally. And then we are inquiring. Maybe we understand a little bit more why they're there. Okay, now that we have all these things, we can do something with it. We can choose, which sometimes is an act of radical kindness, but choosing to nurture that. Nurture, now that I know what's coming up for me, maybe what do I need from, like, what do I need to, how do I speak to my sadness, or what can I do for my sadness? What do I do for happiness? Maybe I need to just sit and enjoy this for a moment, and allow that to happen, and not just think about, oh, when am I not going to be sad again? Right. Or when am I not going to be happy again? And so just thinking about what's one step I can take to respond to this. And that can go in so many different directions. So we'll talk for a minute about two different acronyms that help us just think about how we nurture emotions and kind of day to day, kind of what I call like quote unquote basic, but also like really instrumental things. To what happens when emotions are really big and scary and powerful and almost overwhelming. Like, what do we do with that? Because I recognize that sometimes emotions can pull us pretty far. And throughout, recognizing that coping skills are going to work for a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. So what I encourage is, if you're here and you're listening and you're with us, throw like your favorite coping skill into the chat, of what you're doing right now, or what 2020 forced you to do, or whatever it is that's working for you. Maybe it works for someone else, or we can try it. I was just telling Calista earlier, I was like, I have a brand new coping skill where I'm always going to have something in the books, some kind of like getaway or a time to be excited about. And it's always going to be there, something to think about. And so whatever that is, it can change. So we're going to start with the please skills. And so this is the idea of if we're taking care of ourselves and our body in a lot of really instrumental ways, we're going to strengthen that interconnectedness that we've been speaking to. We're going to have probably a more greater mindfulness ability to know what's happening. And as we practice rain together, or practice rain individually, I mean, if you want to do it together, but as we do it individually, but using these things, these important places to start is going to help that process much, much easier. And we've been, joking about hunger. If there is an imbalance of how much we're eating, or we're not nurturing our physical bodies, the vessel that we exist in, then it might be really hard to expend some of that energy to do this process. Or if we are physically ill, or we're dealing with some kind of medical sickness or injuries, if we're not taking prescribed medications that a medical professional has prescribed and encouraged us to do for our health and well-being, then we may not be able to do all of these things. It might impact the success of that, or feeling more stuck, or maybe we emotions end up not being as useful and as teacher-esque as we can allow them to exist. How substances, for example, can really influence, I think, in so many different ways. Of if we're feeling a certain way, we can use it to change that. And sometimes we feel a certain way and we use it because of that way we feel. And just recognizing the interplay of that, and how it can sometimes complicate our experience. And of course, there's balance to that. There's ways to manage that and being thoughtful of that, but just knowing that those things are directly like created, they're there to impact our emotion. And so that can change things on us, and recognizing the impact that can have. And then sleep and movement, taking care of our vessels, like I said, and recognizing, for example, if there's chronic illness in your life, or a new diagnosis, for example, like that is likely going to take a big spin. We talk about the triangle of different things, or the square, or whatever shape it is, of all the things that the interconnected. Recognizing and allowing and giving space to, like, my emotions might be a whole lot different than they usually are, or just as an example. And so just recognizing how much these things are pretty instrumental day to day, but can have such a huge effect. And then lastly, accepts is it's based out of dialectical behavior therapy. It's this idea that sometimes emotions can be really large and overwhelming, and we might need certain tools to manage them. Because sometimes when we are feeling that way with our emotions, they do tell us to do something behaviorally. They do, they might they might inform a thought, then that tells us to do something, right? And so we realize that can be such a call to action. Sometimes our emotions can be so convincing, and they can really be like, the motivation, the force behind what we do. And so sometimes that's not good or helpful or healthy or whatever that looks like. And so these are some skills that you can rely on. If that's ever the case for you, I keep these in my back pocket for when it's just really high stress or something that like an emergency is going on, or whatever is happening in your emotional world, that these are ways to help you regulate them. And I think that some of them are helpful. Some of them are meant to be temporary and not to be used in excess, because they, down the road, like we talked about, the smushing down or the pushing down of emotions, that's not going to help us long term. And so I want to go through these briefly. So activities, being able to engage in something fun, and pleasurable, happy things that when people talk about like self-care and doing something for yourself, treat yourself or whatever that is, that's kind of, I think, what this is speaking to some degree of this, just making sure we still do something that brings us the feeling that we want. For example, oftentimes I'll work with clients on doing opposite action, of like, if we feel a certain way, or maybe depression is telling us this is what's happening for me, do the opposite. Sometimes we need that, to engage in the thing that we are looking to have more of. And so doing something that's an activity that's helpful or keeps us busy. Um, in that way, doing something for someone else and recognizing um, what benefit can be there for both you and others, and being able to engage in that practice. It can put things in perspective sometimes as well, and just recognizing the greater good that you can do. I think about how this can look when you go to like the Parkway. If you like go to an overlook here in Boone, of just like the vastness of that and how that can just put things into a perspective sometimes, in ways that we may need. Comparison is, I think, a tricky one to be thoughtful of just realizing that like maybe there's a period of your life that has been challenging or worse, or that you've been through, many people have been through a lot, like a lot. And sometimes just recently, sometimes in the past year, but sometimes in your whole life, you've been through maybe sometimes more than what you should have in your entire lifetime. And recognizing that sometimes we are doing the best with what we can, with what we have, and recognizing that like maybe how I'm doing right now is understandable, or that maybe it's like, there was a time in my life where I was struggling or not doing so well, and I recognize that there's room for being able to see this in a different light, and recognize that. And I think this gets tricky with not comparing to other people, because that can be a very quick path to emotional invalidation, of being like, somebody has it worse, so I shouldn't be bothered or whatever about what's happening for me. I shouldn't feel this way. Recognizing that, again, invalidating our experience is just going to create some really harmful feelings, but we're still going to feel what we feel, like they're still going to be there. So I talked about emotions and that opposite action. Pushing away is the one where I say asterisk this, of this is a temporary skill. I think that distraction can be a huge tool. And if we're using it all the time for long periods of time, we end up just being pretty avoidant. And for many, many different things, that you might go to therapy for, or around mental health, but sometimes avoidance is the thing that's fueling some of the things that are happening. And so just being thoughtful of like, how am I using distraction? Am I using it when I need it, and not when, this can be a challenging thing that maybe is better to face. So just knowing that pushing away can be really helpful in that moment of being like that emergency, like action. Thoughts are a big one of just, and this is next week, is thinking about mind-based coping skills. Like, how do we psychologically work on how we can cope? And so just thinking about how we can utilize our thoughts in helpful ways to help us with that. And then lastly, sensations of using our senses to ground us. We will do, I think, a lot of this in 2 weeks, actually. And so thinking about how do we find grounding, and maybe we have a preferred preference. I love lighting a candle. I love the smell of that. Like, that can be really soothing. For other people, they're like, I need the fuzziest of blankets or something. So just knowing what sense you may need based on that emotion. So thinking about the nurture.
Yeah, so because we are short on time today, I'm just going to leave this to be a part of the handout that we have. But um, this is a journal prompt that you can use to kind of check in with yourself and respond to your emotions. So gratitude can often be a really helpful coping skill when we're managing big emotions. So taking a second to think of, what am I thankful for? Also think about thinking of context of your life. What's going on that's making you stressed or making you have a shorter fuse or making you feel so tired? So acknowledging, what am I challenged by in my life right now? What is coming up for me in that way? And what can give context to my emotional experience? I also think about that coping skill of having something on the books, thinking about what is inspiring you to move forward, to wake up every day, to take one step in front of the other. What are some of those things that that you look forward to that can help inspire your emotions to shift, maybe? Um, and also thinking of your worth. What are you worthy of? You are worthy of joy. You are worthy of quality relationships. You're worthy of good sleep. You're worthy of adequate nutrition. Are you giving yourself the things that you are worth, the things that you are allowed and worthy of? So this is just a prompt that you can use to kind of check in with yourself. And I like this prompt because it can take anywhere from 3 minutes to 2 hours. You know, you can just kind of go piece by piece and check in with, what am I experiencing right now, and how can I respond to these emotions? And I love in particular that nurturing piece of, what is a step that I can take? And more specifically, what is a tiny step I can take? Maybe sometimes we don't have the capacity to respond to our emotions in a big way, or do like, I need to go journal for an hour right now, or I need to go for a run right now. Maybe that's not an option. So, what is a tiny way you can nurture? I'm going to go take a lap. I'm going to go get a glass of water, or I'm going to go to the restroom and splash my face, or I'm going to write in the margins of my paper while I'm in class just what I'm feeling or like what's coming up. So, inviting yourself to engage in that reflection and engage in that response, even if the response is something that has to be small right now. And last piece that I would say, I just kind of circling back to um, that pushing away idea. Something that I found helpful too is kind of creating a time where you can worry about things, or creating a time where you can be sad or be angry, and recognizing like, hey, I'm in class for the next 2 hours. So being angry and being frustrated and allowing myself to feel these emotions can't really happen right now. But at 5:30, when I get home for those 20 minutes, I'm going to allow myself to be mad. And then after that, I'm going to move on. I'm going to breathe through it. And so those kinds of things too. And I love emotions because they're so subjective, and you have the opportunity to learn from them, engage in them, figure out what works for you. So I'm going to encourage you to check out the handout, ask any questions, or reach out to us if you have any additional thoughts or concerns, and get to know yourself and how you might build a relationship with these emotions that we've been exploring today.
Awesome. I love those. I love like worry appointments. Like I'm gonna make a list of all the things I'm worried about and stressed about, and then I'm gonna give myself 15 minutes, set a timer on something, and hash it out. Like let her rip, let the worry go, do what we gotta do. And then once that is over, we put ourselves back together how we need to and go about our day or whatever. Yeah. I love the saving it, because who has time to do it right in the moment sometimes? It's just how it goes. So we wanted to make sure we give resources. They're here if you want to like note any of these down, of course. They're in the handout, so feel free to access them that way. A few things here for the Counseling Center. We are still providing services through the summer. So just reach out to us if you are a student and interested in talking more with us and getting some support, whether that's with us or finding someone in the community if that's the case. And then lastly, in the last 2 minutes that we have, if you are willing and able, use the QR code to give us feedback. That is mainly for Callista and I to know how we can do this better in the future. But it's also just the counseling center as a whole. Like, how do we make sure we're providing information in a helpful way? Know how we can continue doing better and serving the campus community here. So Callista, thankfully, appreciate that, putting that link into the chat. So if you're willing and able to do that, we so appreciate it. But happy to stick around if you have something, feel free to run, of course, do what you need. But if you have any questions or thoughts for us, we're happy to hear them. Or if you are good to go, then thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you do want that handout, be sure to leave your email before you leave so that we can send that to you after today.
Yes. So yes, please email. The other option is to grab my email from up here and email me and say, hey, I want that handout. And that works too. So either or. Got it. The last thing I probably should have posted on here is just like I've alluded to, next week is mind-based coping skills. So again, next Wednesday at 3 p.m. I will be co-facilitating that with Matt Morgan here in the Counseling Center. And so that's next week. In 2 weeks, we have body-based coping skills. So we'll be partnering with Wellness and Prevention to do some of the workshop stuff. And then the last week is behavior-based. So what can we do to help us cope with things going on? So kind of breaking it down into those different ways. All right, well, if folks feel free to keep adding the things to the chat, I will make sure to get to note that. But thank you so much for coming and supporting this. And please reach out and let us know how we can support you, or if there's anything else that we can do to help build up the coping skills this summer and going into a new year.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, this has been a joy. We've been looking forward to this, and we hope to see you again in the next few weeks as we unpack the other parts of who we are and our experience. So yeah, thanks for coming.
All right. Bye, everybody. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. Oh, I'm also going